The call came through at 11:47 p.m. while I was standing in a frozen control room watching 2.3 million people lose power. My phone buzzed against my work gloves. I almost ignored it when you're managing a power grid failure that's putting elderly folks in nursing homes at risk during a sub-zero winter storm. Emails from corporate feel pretty low priority. But something made me check it anyway. My name is Wayne Sheffield. I'm 47 years old, and I just got fired via email while trying to prevent people from freezing to death. The message was from Howard Garrett, my operations director at Grid Tech Solutions, short and sweet. Wayne, effective immediately, your employment with Grid Tech Solutions is terminated. Please collect your personal items and surrender your access badge by Monday morning. I stood there for a minute, reading it twice. Beverly Martinez, the grid operations manager, was right next to me watching the cascade failure spread across 3 power districts. She saw my screen over my shoulder. "Everything okay?" she asked, though the look on my face probably answered that question. "I just got fired," I said, showing her the email. Her expression went from confused to horrified. "Fired? But you're the only person who understands these SCADA systems. We've got nursing homes on backup power and the temperature's dropping to -15 tonight. That was the thing about this crisis. Our power grid runs on control software that was installed in 1994. Most of the young engineers at Grid Tech had never even seen code written in the programming language this stuff uses. I'd been with the company for 28 years, starting right out of technical college when my dad lost his job at the auto plant in Cleveland. I'd learned these systems from the ground up, worked every major outage since the ice storm of '98, and personally trained on every upgrade and patch. When cyber criminals hit infrastructure, they usually target the old stuff, because nobody thinks to update security on systems that just work. This attack was different, though. Whoever was behind it had serious resources and deep technical knowledge. They were systematically overloading circuit breakers across the region, creating a cascade failure that would take down the entire Northeast electrical grid if we couldn't stop it. I'd been working the trace for 6 hours, following the attack pattern through 3 separate grid sectors. The power company's emergency protocols required manual reset of each affected circuit, but you had to know exactly which ones to hit and in what sequence, or you'd make the cascade worse instead of better. During my career at Grid Tech, I'd responded to 47 major grid emergencies across 5 states. I'd traced SQL injection attacks on power plant control systems, diagnosed hardware failures in transmission substations, and identified zero-day vulnerabilities that could have caused blackouts affecting millions of people. I'd worked through hurricanes, ice storms, and heat waves. I'd missed my son Jason's high school graduation to fix a substation failure in Pennsylvania. I'd spent my 45th birthday in a control room in Boston debugging SCADA code, while Linda celebrated alone at home. That was how things worked in the old days. When you gave a company your word, you kept it. When they had a crisis, you showed up. Loyalty was supposed to be a two-way street. Or at least that's what I thought until 11:47 p.m. on the coldest night of the year. Most importantly, I developed deep expertise in the legacy control systems that most of the electrical industry still runs on, but nobody teaches anymore. Every major utility had unique implementations. Every grid sector had custom modifications. Every security protocol had quirks that existed only in my experience-based understanding of how those systems behaved under attack. That knowledge was what made me valuable to Grid Tech. That knowledge was also what Howard Garrett had just eliminated from the company's crisis response capability at the worst possible moment. "What should I tell the emergency coordinator?" Beverly asked. "The governor's office is calling every 20 minutes asking for status updates." I thought about that for a second. The attack pattern I'd been tracing showed sophisticated knowledge of power grid vulnerabilities. The hackers weren't just hitting random systems. They were specifically targeting control nodes that would create maximum disruption with minimum effort. This was the kind of coordinated infrastructure attack that kept Homeland Security officials awake at night. "Tell them Grid Tech will need to send another engineer," I said. "I'm no longer employed here, so I can't work on Grid Tech projects. But there is no other engineer who knows these systems. Then Grid Tech has a problem." I started pulling off my work gloves. 28 years of showing up for every crisis, working through personal emergencies, postponing family vacations when some utility company had a software glitch they couldn't figure out. The one time I'd called in sick, food poisoning from a gas station sandwich, I'd still remote access the grid monitoring system from my bathroom floor because they couldn't identify why 2 substations were showing intermittent communication errors. My father worked 23 years at the Ford plant in Cleveland before they moved production to Mexico in 1982. He'd started there straight out of high school, worked his way up to line supervisor, and thought his experience and dedication would protect him from corporate decisions made in boardrooms he'd never see. When they announced the plant closure, he spent 6 months in denial, convinced that his value to the company would somehow save his job. He never found steady work again after that. Died of a heart attack at 56, probably from the stress of bouncing between temporary jobs and watching his pension evaporate while trying to keep our family afloat. I'd promised myself I'd never be that vulnerable to corporate decisions made by people who didn't understand what I did for a living. Turned out I was wrong about that. "You can't just leave," Beverly said. "People could die if we don't restore power to the hospitals and care facilities." Then Howard should have thought about that before firing me during an emergency response. I handed her my diagnostic tablet with all the screens showing system status and attack vectors. "Here's what I've traced so far. The attack is targeting sector control modules in a specific sequence, trying to overload the transmission grid. You'll need someone who understands legacy SCADA programming to complete the circuit isolation and reset procedures." "How long would it take grid tech to find someone else?" Beverly asked, her voice tight with the kind of stress that comes from watching everything you're responsible for fall apart in real time. "The only other person I know who understands this software is Alan Foster, and he's retired, living in Florida. Might take a few days to get him up here, assuming he's willing to travel in this weather and still remembers the control protocols." Beverly went pale. "A few days?" "The backup generators at Pine Valley Nursing Home only have 18 hours of fuel left. Harbor Community Hospital is already on emergency power. That hit me hard. Pine Valley was where my neighbor Mrs. Patterson lived, 92 years old with emphysema, completely dependent on her oxygen concentrator. Without power, that machine stops working. Harbor Community was where Jason was born 19 years ago, where Linda had her appendix out last spring. But I wasn't a grid tech employee anymore. Howard had made that crystal clear at the worst possible moment. "I understand the urgency," I said, "but I can't ethically work on grid tech projects when I'm no longer employed by grid tech. That would create liability issues for everyone involved." I walked out of that control room at 12:15 a.m., leaving behind nearly 3 decades of crisis management and emergency response. The corridors were eerily quiet except for the hum of backup lighting and the distant sound of emergency generators. I passed the break room where I'd eaten thousands of meals during late-night repairs, the equipment storage where I'd kept spare parts for systems that were old when I started working here. Got in my truck and drove home through neighborhoods that were going dark one by one as the cascade failure spread. Traffic lights were out on Main Street. The 7-Eleven was running on generator power, casting weird shadows through the windows. A few houses still had lights, probably from personal generators, but most of the residential areas were completely black. Linda was waiting up for me, which she always did during major outages. She'd learned over the years that when the power grid had problems, I might not be home for days. She took one look at my face and knew something had gone sideways. "They fired me," I said, dropping my work bag by the kitchen door, email. While I was working the emergency, she just stared at me for a minute, processing what that meant. During the power outage, middle of the worst grid attack we've ever seen, 2.5 million people without power in sub-zero weather. Linda's not an engineer, but she's lived with one long enough to understand how these things work. She knows I'm the guy they call when everything else fails. She also knows that Howard Garrett has been pushing to replace senior staff with cheaper, younger engineers for the past 2 years, part of some cost-cutting initiative from corporate headquarters. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Grid tech figures out how to fix a grid attack without the person who knows how to fix grid attacks. And the people without heat?" I didn't have a good answer for that. Part of me wanted to drive back to the control center and finish the job, regardless of what Howard had done. That's what I would have done 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. But watching what happened to my father had taught me something important about the difference between being loyal and being used. My phone started ringing at 6:30 a.m. "Paul Anderson, Grid Tech's Chief Operating Officer." I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message while making coffee. "Wayne, there's been a misunderstanding about your employment status. We need you to return immediately to complete the power restoration. The situation has deteriorated overnight. Call me back as soon as you get this. A misunderstanding." That was corporate speak for we made a catastrophic error, and now we're trying to figure out how to fix it without admitting we were wrong. I called him back at 7 a.m. after I'd had my coffee and thought through exactly what I wanted to say. "Wayne, thank God, we need you back at the grid control center immediately. The cascade failure has spread to 5 more sectors overnight. We've got hospitals switching to backup power across 3 states. "I'm no longer a grid tech employee," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. Howard was very clear about that in his email. "There's been a miscommunication. We can discuss your employment status after we resolve this emergency." No miscommunication. Howard sent a termination email at 11:47 p.m. I have it right here if you want me to forward it to you, pretty straightforward language. Long pause. I could hear him breathing, probably trying to figure out how to navigate the mess Howard had created. Paul Anderson had been with Grid Tech for 15 years and understood exactly how critical my role was to emergency response. He was also smart enough to realize that this wasn't just about one disgruntled employee. Wayne, this is a critical situation. People's lives are at stake. I understand that. Grid Tech will need to send another engineer who's qualified to work on legacy SCADA control systems. You know we don't have anyone else who understands those systems like you do. That's an unfortunate situation, but it's not my problem anymore since I'm no longer required. Another pause. I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice. Paul understood the implications in a way that Howard obviously didn't. This wasn't just about completing one emergency repair. This was about Grid Tech's entire reputation in the utility industry. Word travels fast when a company can't handle the kind of infrastructure crisis that's their core business. What would it take to get you back there? Now we were getting somewhere. At 47, I'd never seriously considered working for myself. The idea of giving up steady employment, health insurance, and retirement benefits seemed too risky, especially with Jason heading to college next year. But sitting in my kitchen at 7 a.m., watching the news reports of rolling blackouts across the region, I realized that steady employment was an illusion anyway. Howard had proven that 28 years of dedication and expertise meant nothing when it became convenient to eliminate my position. I could be available as an independent consultant. What would your consulting rate be? I thought about that carefully. Independent consulting rates for emergency infrastructure work typically range from $300 to $800 per hour, depending on expertise level and urgency. I was at the top of the expertise scale, and this was definitely urgent. More than that, I was apparently the only person available who could solve this problem. That kind of scarcity has real market value. Emergency grid restoration consulting is $800 per hour, I said. Minimum 48-hour engagement to ensure complete vulnerability patching and system validation. Payment terms are 50% deposit before I resume work, remaining 50% upon successful system restoration. $800 per hour. That's my emergency rate for critical infrastructure work during life-threatening situations. Take it or leave it. Wayne, that's $38,400 for 2 days, 48 hours minimum. If it takes longer, the rate continues at $800 per hour, and I'll need the payment transferred to my business account before I start work. The silence stretched out for nearly a minute. I could hear him thinking through the implications. Grid Tech had been billing the power company around $150 per hour for my services as an employee. As an independent consultant dealing with a crisis that was costing millions per hour in economic losses, emergency power purchases, and potential regulatory fines, $800 was actually reasonable. More than reasonable, it was probably a bargain. But Paul was thinking like a corporate manager instead of someone buying specialized expertise during an emergency. That's the difference between employee thinking and consultant thinking right there. I'll need to get approval from executive management, he said, finally. No problem. When you have the money transferred and a consulting contract signed, give me a call. I'll be standing by. He called back at 9:15 a.m. Wayne, we have approval for your consulting agreement. Can you be here by 10? I'll need to see the payment confirmation first. At 9:30, my phone chimed with a bank transfer notification. $38,400 had just cleared into my personal checking account. More money than I'd ever received in a single day during my entire 28-year career. Linda was watching the news coverage of the blackouts when I showed her the bank notification. $38,000, she said. For 2 days of work, that's what Grid Tech is willing to pay to get their most expensive crisis resolved. This is more than you made in 6 months as their employee. She was right, and that fact was starting to sink in. I'd been undervaluing my expertise for years, maybe decades. When you're an employee, you think about your salary in terms of what the company can afford to pay you. When you're a consultant, you think about your rate in terms of what your knowledge is worth to someone who desperately needs it. I arrived at the Grid Control Center at 10 a.m., not as a Grid Tech employee, but as an independent consultant billing $800 per hour. The difference in how that felt was remarkable. Every minute I worked was building my business instead of someone else's company. Every problem I solved was enhancing my reputation instead of just doing my job. More importantly, I was in complete control. If Howard wanted to fire me again, he'd have to wait until I finished the work and collected my payment. And if he tried to interfere with my work, I could walk away and keep the deposit. The grid restoration was more complex than I'd initially estimated. The attack had spread to 7 different control sectors overnight, each one requiring individual diagnosis and manual reset procedures. The hackers had been busy while Grid Tech was trying to figure out how to replace me. Beverly filled me in on what had happened during the 10 hours I was away. We lost 2 more transmission substations around 3 a.m. The cascade spread to the regional interconnect, so now we're affecting power supply to parts of Vermont and New Hampshire. The governor declared a state of emergency at 6 a.m. That meant federal oversight, media attention, and potential congressional hearings if this went on much longer. Grid tech wasn't just dealing with a technical crisis anymore. This was becoming a political problem. I spent the first 4 hours retracing the attack vectors and understanding how the intrusion had evolved overnight. The hackers had adapted their strategy, probably because they realized grid tech's response had been delayed. Instead of just overloading individual circuits, they were now targeting the control protocols that managed power flow between different grid sectors. This was sophisticated work. Someone with serious resources and deep knowledge of power grid architecture was systematically probing for ways to cause maximum disruption. The kind of attack that national security experts worried about but most people assumed would never actually happen. By 2 p.m., I'd identified the core vulnerability and developed a systematic approach to isolating the affected control systems. The work required updating security protocols on 15-year-old SCADA systems, implementing new authentication procedures, and manually resetting circuit breakers across a 3-state region. All of this had to be done in the correct sequence or the cascade failure would restart and spread even further. The restoration process took 72 hours instead of 48. Not because the technical work was more difficult than expected, but because I followed every safety protocol to the letter, documented every step thoroughly, and double-checked every circuit before energizing it. When you're billing $800 per hour, you can afford to be extra careful. When people's lives depend on getting it right the first time, being extra careful isn't optional. Grid tech's management was watching the clock and calculating their consulting costs. But they couldn't argue with my methods. Every procedure I followed was straight out of their own emergency response manual. I was just doing it more methodically than they were used to seeing during a crisis. During those 3 days, something interesting started happening. Word was getting around the utility industry that Grid Tech had brought in an independent consultant to handle their crisis. I got calls from 4 other power companies asking if I was available for emergency consulting work. A transmission cooperative in Pennsylvania wanted someone to evaluate their cybersecurity vulnerabilities. A municipal utility in Massachusetts needed help upgrading their legacy control systems. Beverly connected me with a military contractor who was looking for someone to assess power infrastructure security at Air Force bases in the Northeast. The Department of Energy was launching a new initiative to identify vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, and they needed consultants with real-world experience in power grid security. By the time I finished the grid tech restoration, I had enough potential consulting work lined up to keep me busy for the next 6 months, all of it at rates that made my old grid tech salary look like pocket change. Total payment for the grid tech crisis, $57,600 for 3 days of work. But the real education came from watching Grid Tech's management realize what they'd lost. During those 3 days, Paul Anderson made it clear that this was about more than just solving one emergency. They were starting to understand that firing me hadn't eliminated a position, it had eliminated their entire capability to handle this type of crisis. Beverly was the one who spelled it out most clearly. "We've got 15 younger engineers on staff," she told Paul during one of their emergency meetings that I overheard. "But none of them have ever seen an attack like this. Wayne's not just an employee we can replace. He's institutional knowledge walking around in work boots." That institutional knowledge was exactly what I'd been building for 28 years without really thinking about its market value. Every crisis I'd solved, every system I'd learned, every vendor relationship I'd developed, all of that was walking out the door when Howard fired me. Grid Tech was discovering that replacing expertise isn't the same as replacing a person. Within 6 months of the power grid crisis, I'd incorporated Sheffield Power Consulting. The military contractor work led to a Department of Energy contract worth $450,000 over 8 months. The Pennsylvania Transmission Cooperative hired me for a full security audit at $500 per hour. 2 municipal utilities wanted ongoing vulnerability assessments. By the end of my first year as an independent consultant, I was billing $1.4 million annually and had more work than I could handle alone. I started hiring other experienced engineers who'd been pushed out by companies that thought experience was expensive. Turns out there's a whole network of displaced experts who understand critical infrastructure better than the people who replaced them. Howard Garrett lasted 8 more months at GridTech before the board terminated his position. The company's internal investigation determined that his decision to fire me during the crisis had cost GridTech approximately $2.8 million in lost contracts, emergency consulting fees, regulatory fines, and reputation damage in the utility industry. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were now paying me more in 6 months than they'd paid me in 3 years as an employee. But it wasn't just about the money. When clients called Sheffield Power Consulting for crisis management, they understood they were paying premium rates for premium expertise. Nobody questioned whether my approach was worth the investment because they'd all seen what happened when they tried to solve infrastructure problems without specialized knowledge. GridTech offered me a permanent consulting retainer during my 2nd year. I accepted, but now I was the one setting the terms. $600 per hour for routine work, $1,000 per hour for emergency response, 30-day payment terms, and a clause guaranteeing I couldn't be terminated during active projects. The best part wasn't the money, though the money was good. It was the security that came from controlling my own value. At 47, I wasn't worried about corporate restructuring, budget cuts, or some new manager deciding I was too expensive. My security came from what I knew how to do, not from what someone else decided I was worth. Linda and I paid off our mortgage 3 years early. Jason's college tuition was fully funded without student loans. We finally took that trip to Alaska we'd been talking about for 20 years, and I didn't have to ask anyone's permission to take 2 weeks off in the middle of summer. More importantly, we started planning for a future that we controlled instead of hoping for a future that depended on corporate decisions made by people who didn't understand what I contributed. The consulting business grew beyond what I'd imagined was possible. By year 3, Sheffield Power Consulting employed 8 people and was handling critical infrastructure projects across 12 states. We specialized in the kind of complex, high-stakes work that most companies couldn't or wouldn't tackle. Legacy system security, emergency grid restoration, vulnerability assessments for critical facilities. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I just ignored that termination email and kept working. I'd still be a GridTech employee making $78,000 a year, worried about the next round of layoffs, hoping my experience would protect me from the next Howard Garrett. Instead, I learned what my father never had the chance to figure out. Your value isn't determined by what one company is willing to pay you. It's determined by what the market will pay for what you know how to do. And sometimes the market values that knowledge a lot more than your employer ever did. Getting fired at 47 during the worst crisis of my career turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to my professional life. Not because I was angry or wanted revenge, but because it forced me to discover what I was actually worth. These days, when GridTech has an emergency, they call Sheffield Power Consulting. I show up with the same expertise and the same commitment to getting the job done right. The only difference is now they pay market rate for crisis management instead of taking it for granted. 5 years later, I look back at that night in the frozen control room as the moment everything changed. Not because Howard fired me, that was just corporate stupidity. The real change happened when I decided to stop accepting someone else's valuation of my worth and started determining it myself. If you're reading this and you're over 45 working for a company that treats your experience like an expense instead of an asset, let me tell you something important. The expertise you've built over decades has real market value. The knowledge in your head about how things actually work, about what goes wrong and how to fix it, about relationships and systems and institutional memory, all of that is worth more than you think. Companies will always try to convince you that you're replaceable, that your experience doesn't justify your cost, that younger and cheaper is better. Sometimes they're right about cheaper. They're almost never right about better. And the market knows the difference, even when your current employer doesn't. Your expertise belongs to you, not to them. And if they can't see the value in what you know, there are others who can. The question isn't whether you're worth more than they're paying you. The question is whether you're brave enough to find out how much more. That seems fair to me.
They say just forget. Move on like it's easy. But forgetting you feels like remembering someone I've never seen. I've been trying to erase you from the places in my mind, but the harder that I fight it, the more you're hard to leave behind. Every memory keeps slipping through the cracks I try to close, like a face I should remember, but somehow never know. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Every moment turns to fragments, every thought just fades to blue, like I'm searching for a feeling that still only leads to you. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. But now every empty moment still reminds me what is real. Forgetting you feels impossible, like chasing something I can't hold, like trying to remember someone that I've never even known. I keep reaching through the silence for a past I can't undo, 'cause letting go of what we had feels like losing something true. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would, but pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger, now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. So keep your sympathy behind you, I don't need what's left undone. Sometimes losing who once broke you is how healing has begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow. I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling. I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone again.